Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We're so delighted that you're part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. Thank you so much for joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, Amazon Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcasts. We have a really fun show for you today. Our guest is Beth Anderson. She is here to tell us all about Smelly Kelly and his super senses. Before we invite Beth into the studio, we want to let you know we have a brand new Reading with Your Kids certified great read, Henry and the Gym Monster by Ben Lancourt. We love this book. It's a beautiful picture book that talks to kids about self-control and how they can make better choices, especially within the setting of a phys ed class, a gym class. Your kids are really going to love it. We really love it. Great illustrations and a great story. Congratulations to Ben Lancourt. His book, Henry and the Gym Monster, is our latest Reading with Your Kids certified great read. You can check out our blog and our full review on our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Joining us right now from Colorado, we're here to celebrate a great new picture book. I love the title, Smelly Kelly and His Super Senses. Please welcome to the show, Beth Anderson. Beth, how are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here and share Smelly Kelly.
I'm really happy. You know, I grew up, I know it's not okay to give folks nicknames anymore. You know, it's just, but I grew up where everybody had a nickname, and most of them were fun. I understand, you know, nicknames can be hurtful sometimes, so I guess we're progressing. But I love this, Smelly Kelly and the Super Senses, and I have a feeling that Mr. Kelly kind of appreciated the smelly name that he earned. Am I right about that?
You are correct, and I always like to tell kids, you know, you never give somebody a nickname that they don't approve of, because we always want it to be a kind and appreciative nickname, not something nasty. And for Smelly Kelly, you know, with his totally awesome nose, that was sort of a badge of honor for him.
Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about this superhero of senses? What was his job, and how did he help people with his amazing nose?
Well, he was an immigrant from Ireland who came over after World War I to the United States. He settled in New York City, and in looking for a job, I imagine he would have found that his nose was a curse and a blessing, because, you know, there's a lot of bad smells as well as good smells. So, you know, one of the first spreads is that him looking for a job where he's considering meat packing, yuck. Sanitation, you know, they had horses in the streets with wagons, so, you know, there was a lot to clean up. And he ended up in the subway. And the subway was new at the time, and they were building and expanding, and it was kind of a mysterious thing in New York because nobody really understood what was going on down there, and so they blamed the subway for every problem. You know, leaks and stinks and anything happening on the streets, it was the subway. So he started out just accidentally, I think, using his extraordinary nose, and he sniffed out leaks. Like, he could smell water.
Wow.
So he could catch a leak before it became so bad that there was a cave-in. And of course, he could smell gas fumes and all sorts of things. So he was a real valuable guy, and they realized that when he kind of saved the day a few times. And then his job became the first New York City subway inspector.
I thought you were going to say he was the first New York subway sniffer, but inspector is a better title.
He was a sniffer, but, they used inspector.
I think a lot of people, and I was surprised to find out that there are vehicles that drive around cities that actually sniff the ground. They have these little things underneath them. They sniff the ground for gas leaks and whatnot. And Mr. Kelly was doing that with his nose.
I didn't know that. I've never heard of these vehicles. Yeah, he was doing it, and I think later, somebody asked him towards the end of his life if bringing in dogs as sniffers was a problem for him, and he said no, because dogs aren't allowed on the subway. He had a great sense of humor, kind of a dry sense of humor, but he seemed like lots of fun.
I'm Matt, as you were talking about, the time period, we're talking about the early 1900s, after
20s, 30s, 40s, yeah.
And the world was different then. It was, when we think of a smelly place and, smelly moments in our lives, I think you can probably take that and magnify it by about 100 when we're talking about the 20s and 30s.
Right. And when I was researching this, I found some really cool things. And my favorite was a stench map.
A stench map?
A map of stinks. So this was so fun, because then I could use this to help me write the story. But, there was a map that showed all the stinky places in New York City. Like butcher shops and, all industries of all kinds. So that was a really fun thing. And you get to wondering, why would you have a stink map, right? Mm-hmm. Well, in the old days, they thought disease was caused by smells and odors. And so they would map out where those odors were, because some people were more sensitive to that, and they blamed them for sickness as well,
Wow, boy, wouldn't it be helpful these days if we could smell coronavirus?
It would be.
Yeah.
It would be great.
Yeah. There are a couple of things I wanted to ask you. You were a teacher for English language learners.
Right.
For a long time. So it sounds like you would, although I imagine Mr. Kelly was able to speak English when he arrived, but you have a real connection with folks who are new to the country.
I do. I have a special soft spot for immigrants and refugees, and those kids just taught me so much about the world that I just appreciate that experience forever. And it colors what I do, what I write, and how I write. And, one of the things that makes me write what I write with narrative nonfiction and historical fiction that's almost 100% true, is that there's so much extra content in those stories. You can learn social studies and science and history while you're reading a fun story. And for English language learners, they're trying to catch up on language, but also on all the other content in school. Mm-hmm. So, a fifth or sixth grader that hasn't had the content in English is missing a lot of information. And all of that background in these stories, like my first one with the Revolutionary War, that's some basic American culture that they need to know, and that all supports that knowledge and brings them things in the midst of a great story that's actual learning.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? It just seems intuitive to me to understand that if you want to teach something to kids, the best way to do it is through story, and not by having them line up in a row in a classroom and just spit off facts and ask them to spit it back. How did we go from centuries of telling each other stories around the campfire and sharing knowledge in that way to the classic, here are these facts, and memorize them and spit them back to me?
Well, I think we're doing better these days than we did, a few generations ago. When I was a kid, though, I have to say that history wasn't my favorite subject. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason is because the human side of history was sort of left out. It was a lot of names and dates and places. And so it didn't have a whole lot of meaning, because to me, the fascinating part of history is those people in those times trying to understand their world and meet those challenges, and so when you get it in that context of a human being being faced with these challenges and having to make a decision that actually could change history, when we can look at that now in a story, it just has so much more meaning than if we took the little pieces.
Yeah.
And one of the great things about Smelly Kelly as a teacher for me is that I think that story is not just an entertaining story, which is interesting and funny at the same time, but it's also kind of the intersection of science and social studies. Because when you look at the growing city of New York and you see how that interacts with all the other pieces of the puzzle, transportation has to grow, more buildings digging into the ground, affecting everything that's in the ground, like all the water mains and electric wires, and so everything impacts something else. And we can't just separate out electricity or chemistry or construction. They all interact, and all those occupations interact. So it gives us a real gives us a real sense of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe helps us find our place in it.
Yeah. I'm thinking that it's really important. And one of the things I love to do, and sometimes it really horrifies me, is to put myself back in those times. And I'm almost old enough to have been alive back when Smelly Kelly was sniffing the subway. But, it's the world has changed, though. And I think it's really helpful to think and to place ourselves in those different times. I also think that understanding how far we've come and how much society has changed and gotten better since the 20s and the 30s can help give kids hope that things are going to be even better in the future.
Right. It does, I think.
Yeah.
And when you look at, most of us don't even think about when our internet goes out or our electricity goes out, we don't think about what's really going on, what happened, what's the cause of that. We're just angry because we can't get on our computer, right?
Yeah.
So, seeing something like his world where all those things are like a maze under the streets, and everything that you do above ground affects what's underground. It gives you that basic understanding of all that. But also in my second book, Lizzie Demands a Seat, her story is a lot like Rosa Parks' story, only it's a full century earlier. She was thrown off a streetcar in New York City in 1854.
Wow.
And she fought for the right to ride. And she ended up in court, and her court case was the first victory against segregation on transportation.
Oh.
And part of the reason I love her story is it fills in a piece of history that was kind of missing in my education. Mm-hmm. We get slavery, we get the Civil War, freeing the slaves, and we get the Civil Rights era with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, but we don't really see what happened in between, and we don't know what life was like in the North. So even though the blacks were free in the North, they still didn't have equality. And so seeing that long struggle and seeing the progress that has come, it kind of shows us that we're not there yet, but it also helps us understand that this is a long challenge of history, and we all need to play a role in this and, step up and let's make it go faster, right?
Absolutely. Talk a little bit, please, Beth, about your experience working with people from different parts of the world. We hear, controversies about immigration and should people be here, should they come in. For you, why is it important for us, for the United States, to live up to that reputation of being open to folks from other countries, to being that home for refugees?
Well, we're a nation of immigrants, and I think, for the population that has been here a long time and don't really remember or haven't heard the stories of their roots and their great-great-grandparents who came and all the, the reasons they came and the struggles they had and the challenges they faced when they got here, I think this kind of renews that sense of strength that we all have within ourselves. And maybe we don't know it's there. But in working with immigrants and refugees, it's so refreshing to me to see and hear about different times and places and cultures and different ways to look at things. Mm-hmm. And you start to not only learn about their culture, but you start to see the United States through their eyes and how crazy our language is and how, why don't black people and white people get along? It's puzzling for them. Mm-hmm. And we have diversity whereas many countries don't. So that's a whole new, concept for kids to deal with and finding their place in all that. So to me, it's just endlessly fascinating. And one of the things I loved so much about my job was that, I was teaching them English to communicate, but I would get kids who came with zero English, mm-hmm. who came not even knowing the alphabet. And it's amazing how much we can communicate without knowing the same language, just by being people and, human beings, because faces and hands and just, experiencing each other is so astounding when you see what can be communicated without language.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how much courage must you need to be a young person without being able to speak any of the language of the land that you're in and then go to school. That must be terrifying, and it must take tremendous courage.
I think it is very terrifying, and another part of my job that I love was being able to meet those kids in the office before they even, stepped into that scary part of the school with all the kids running around speaking another language, and in kind of, be their guide mm-hmm. and help them find their way and, pick out a partner for them to help them through the day, to eat lunch with them and check on them during the day several times and make sure they're okay. But, kids are amazing, and kids, especially the really young ones, they are fascinated by people coming in with that experience, and, they want to talk to them and ask them a million questions. And of course, those new kids can't always answer those, but they really do take them under their wing and show the best of what mm-hmm. people can be, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Earlier you said that getting to know folks from other cultures, from other countries, and learning about those other cultures and countries gave you an opportunity to learn more about your own culture and country. That's really fascinating. I think that that's something that we don't appreciate as much as we should, that taking the time to get to know somebody who is different can really be eye-opening in terms of seeing who we are.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of us would take comments coming from another point of view as maybe we get defensive, or maybe we think, well, they just don't understand. But if we kind of step into their shoes and take a look, it's kind of surprising. Mm-hmm. And one of the anecdotes I have, that I think it was a boy from France who made a comment about English once, that we chew our words. Mm. And I had never thought of it that way. I thought that was so interesting. But, just little things like that make you go, he's right. We do.
Yeah. That's fascinating. It reminds me, we hosted international kids in our home for a long time. And one young woman from Italy came over, and she was with us for about a week, and we asked her what was the most surprising thing that she had found. And she said, "I'm really surprised that no one in your family is fat. I thought everybody in America would be fat."
Yes. And that's another thing. Like, I went overseas as an exchange student when I was in high school, and the images that other countries have of the U.S. is both embarrassing and surprising. Because a lot of them see the movies or the TV shows and they think that's how we are.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things, Beth, that I saw on your website is that you think that writing is like mining. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that writing is a process of digging into either something else or yourself. And when you're digging into research for a story and you're finding all these little bits and pieces, like little rocks, and they're not, you can't just throw them together and make a story. You have to really pick out the really valuable pieces and polish them with words, word choice and sentence structure and how you arrange them. So it's a process of digging and polishing. So it's also recognizing the valuable bits and bringing them together into a polished piece.
It's interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, we have a lot of nonfiction authors on, and a lot of folks, write about, the great names throughout history, like Rosa Parks and Dr. King and George Washington. But the characters that you're writing about introducing are a bit more obscure. How did you discover Smelly Kelly?
Well, I love obscure stories, and I actually have one obscure story about Benjamin Franklin and Noah Webster, which I have never met another person except one writer who had seen the same article I saw, that Ben Franklin created his own alphabet.
I was not aware of that.
That immediately got me when I saw that. So, I look for articles, I listen to podcasts and stories and just kind of expose myself to lots of different news feeds. And every once in a while you pick up a little tidbit that you think, oh, this could be a story. And I did find Smelly Kelly on a news feed and then dug into him and found, because immediately that smelly is going to connect to kids, right? And it turns out he was a hero in his own right. So his story was one that was really irresistible to me because of the fun in it, but also the surprises and the value of, the human experience in that story. And the problem with obscure people is that a lot of publishers think they're too obscure and no one will care. So you have to create a story that makes people care or makes, a story that matters. Mm-hmm. Now, Elizabeth Jennings is a person who people are starting to hear about, and she's going to have a statue in New York City this year sometime.
Oh, wonderful.
So she was a very little known person, but she's getting some press lately. Yeah. And her story is, I guess, more easily published because of the role she played and the court case. And then, of course, you got Ben Franklin and Noah Webster, and, those guys are famous, but maybe something they did or their friendship is something nobody knows about. So I like to find those little obscure pieces and explore them.
Yeah. Is there an obscure person or story that you're researching now that you can tell us about?
I'm always working on obscure stories. I usually don't share what I'm doing, although there's one that actually is under contract and it hasn't been announced yet, but I feel like it's safe to say it's about Deborah Sampson. And a lot of people have heard of her, but she was a woman in the Revolutionary War who dressed up as a man to serve in the Continental Army.
Oh, wow.
So her story is very fascinating. And she, and the problem too with these people is there's not much information on them. Mm-hmm. There's very little. And so that becomes a huge challenge. But she was the first person, I believe, to get a pension. Her husband got the first widower's pension when she died. She had to fight for her pension as a woman, and she did such a tremendous job as a loyal and brave soldier that the officers that she worked under had no problem, recommending her and telling others what a great soldier she was.
Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Right.
So immediately people are going to say, well, I want to find out where Beth's website is so I can be the first to know when this new story is available.
My website is bethandersonwriter.com.
Awesome. We've had a great time speaking about Smelly Kelly and his super senses and a whole lot more with author Beth Anderson. Beth, thank you so much for being part of our show.
Well, thank you, Jed. I appreciate it, and it's been lots of fun.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're going to be celebrating the end of Women's History Month with a really wonderful interview with Andrea Williams. She is the author of Baseball's Leading Lady, Effa Manley, and the Rise and Fall of the Negro Leagues. That is the next episode of the podcast. If you are the author of a great children's book, we would love to have you as a guest on the show. Being a guest, it's fun, it's easy, and it gives you the chance to tell thousands of people about your fantastic book. And there's no need for you to pay anybody to facilitate your appearance on the show. Just go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, click on the guest authors click here button at the top of the page and scroll on down to where it says be a guest. I get that thing all mixed up. I was guesting first and not authoring, but readingwithyourkids.com, click on the authors click here, scroll down to be a guest. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. I want to thank our guest, Beth Anderson. Be sure to check out Smelly Kelly and his super senses. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan, Alexia Brown, Hannah Pat Oboyski. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.